Brian Connolly had one of the most amazing voices in rock music during the 1970s. He was the lead singer of a super-famous glam rock band called Sweet. They made huge hits like Ballroom Blitz and Fox on the Run that everyone loved and sang along to. These songs were on the radio all the time and made Brian a big star. He topped the music charts and helped create a whole new style of music that people still remember today. But even though everything looked shiny and perfect on the outside, things behind the scenes were really tough. Being famous brought a lot of stress and pressure that Brian wasn't ready for. The band members started fighting with each other, and slowly, everything began to fall apart. Brian's life took a really sad turn after all the fame was gone. He went from playing in huge stadiums packed with thousands of screaming fans to singing in small, quiet bars where hardly anyone came. He went from being a superstar that everyone knew to struggling just to get by each day. In the last years of his life, Brian finally opened up and told people what really happened behind all the fame. He explained why things went so wrong and how he lost everything he had worked so hard to build. Come with us as we discover the real story and learn about the sadness hidden behind all those catchy songs. But first, to really understand what happened, we need to go way back to where it all started. Let's learn about Brian Connolly's early life and how his journey began. Brian Connolly's story started in a town called Hamilton in South Lanarkshire, Scotland, back in 1945. Right from the very beginning, his life was really hard and difficult. His birth mother was a young teenage girl named Frances Connolly. She worked as a waitress to make money. When Brian was just a tiny baby, she left him all alone in a hospital in Glasgow. She was probably scared and didn't know what else to do. Nobody ever found out who Brian's real father was. It remained a mystery that was never solved, even many years later. When Brian was only 2 years old, something good finally happened to him. A nice, caring couple named Jim and Helen McManus decided to foster him. They lived in a place called Blantyre. They took baby Brian into their home and raised him just like he was their own child. They loved him and took care of him. They gave Brian their family name, McManus, so he grew up being called Brian McManus. For many, many years, Brian truly believed that Jim and Helen were his real mom and dad. He had no idea at all about his true background or where he really came from. He thought he was just a regular kid with regular parents. But when Brian turned 18 years old, everything in his world suddenly changed. Someone sat him down and told him the truth. He had been adopted as a baby. Finding out this shocking news really shook Brian up inside. It made him feel confused and lost. He started wondering who he really was. After learning the truth, Brian made an important decision. He decided to take back his birth name, Connolly, to honor and remember his real mother, even though he had never really known her. This discovery was the beginning of a journey that would last his whole life, a search to find out who he really was and where he truly belonged. There was even an interesting rumor going around. Some people said that a famous actor named Mark McManus, who starred in a TV show called Taggart, might be related to Brian. The two men looked so much alike that it was really striking. Some people even thought they might have had the same father, which would make them half-brothers. Nobody knows for sure if this was true or not, but it added an extra layer of mystery and intrigue to Brian's already complicated story. As a young man growing up, Brian had pretty simple dreams at first. He originally wanted to become an engineer, which is someone who builds and fixes things. He studied engineering in school and made plans for a normal, stable, predictable life with a steady job. But deep down in his heart, something else was calling to him: music. Brian had natural charm that made people like him right away. He was also very good-looking, which got him noticed wherever he went. But most importantly, he had a smooth, beautiful singing voice that really stood out. When he sang, people stopped and listened. He didn't realize it yet, but that special voice of his would soon make him one of the most famous and recognizable singers of the entire 1970s decade. Brian's real musical journey began when he joined a band that was called Wainwright's Gentlemen. At that time, this group was already pretty well known in the London area. They performed shows in different neighborhoods like Hayes, Harrow, and Wembley. The band was managed by one of the band members' fathers, who helped book their shows and organize everything. They played their music at local clubs, where people would come to dance and have fun. The band even got to compete in some national music contests, which was a big deal. In one of those important competitions, they got to perform at a famous place called the Lyceum Strand. Parts of their performance were even broadcast on BBC One television, which meant lots of people got to see them perform. This was really exciting for the young musicians. By this time, the band had already gone through many different lineup changes over the years. Different musicians had joined and left the group. Some really big names had passed through this band's ranks over time, including a singer named Ian Gillan. Ian Gillan would later become super famous as the lead singer of a huge rock band called Deep Purple. When Ian Gillan decided to leave Wainwright's Gentlemen in 1965, the band needed a new lead singer. That's when Brian Connolly got his big chance. He took over as the new lead vocalist, which meant he would be the main singer up front. Brian's talent and energy on stage quickly made a big impact on everyone who saw him perform. People really liked him. The drummer in the band at that time was a guy named Mick Tucker. Mick and Brian became really close friends, and they would end up working together for many years to come. The two of them had incredible chemistry together. It was like they could read each other's minds when they played music. They just clicked perfectly. Soon, Brian and Mick started wanting more. They wanted to start something completely new and different that belonged to just them. After performing with Wainwright's Gentlemen for a while, both of them decided to leave the band in late 1967. They wanted to chase a new direction and see what else they could create together. This decision to leave and start fresh was actually the beginning of something much, much bigger than they could have imagined. It was the birth of what would become the band Sweet, though they didn't know it yet. In January 1968, Brian and Mick decided to form their own brand new group. They decided to call it The Sweet Shop. They brought in a bassist and vocalist named Steve Priest, who had been playing with another band called The Army. They also recruited a guitarist named Frank Torpe, who had played music with Mick Tucker before in previous bands. The new group made their very first live performance, debut at a venue called the Pavilion in Hemel Hempstead on March 9, 1968. This was their first show in front of a real audience. They started out pretty small, playing for modest crowds, but people who came to see them definitely noticed their energy and excitement. They were fun to watch. Their songs were catchy and easy to remember, and they had a sound that really stood out from other bands playing at the time. The band was managed by a guy named Paul Nicholas. Paul would later go on to become quite famous himself for starring in a popular musical called Hair. Paul worked very closely with a record producer named Phil Wainman, who really liked the young band's sound and their youthful energy. Phil thought they had potential to become something big. Phil Wainman helped them record their very first single, which was a song called Slow Motion. The song was released under a record label called Fontana Records. Everyone was excited about this first release. But just before the record came out, the band ran into a problem. They discovered that another artist was already using the name Sweet Shop for their act. Since two bands can't have the same name, Brian's group had to make a change. They decided to shorten their name to just The Sweet. It was simple, easy to remember, and it stuck. From that point on, they were known as The Sweet. Unfortunately, their first few singles didn't do very well at all. They recorded several different songs and released them, but none of them made it onto the music charts. This was really disappointing and frustrating for everyone in the band. After about a year of trying, guitarist Frank Torpe got so frustrated that he decided to leave the band. It was a hard time for everyone. But Brian and Mick refused to give up on their dream. They were determined to keep going no matter what. Their confidence in themselves and their strong teamwork kept them together through all the ups and downs. They believed that eventually something good would happen. After Frank Torpe left the band, Sweet went through several more changes and different musicians. A guitarist named Mick Stewart joined them in 1969. He brought some good rock music experience because he had previously played with bands called the Red Caps and Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. Around this same time, Sweet signed a brand new record deal with a big company called EMI, specifically with their Parlophone label. This was a major step forward. They released 3 new singles, Lollipop Man, All You'll Ever Get From Me, and Get on the Line. The band had high hopes for these songs, but sadly, none of these songs became hits either. They still weren't making it onto the charts. Despite all these setbacks and disappointments, Brian's determination never, ever faded. He still deeply believed that the band could make it big someday. He refused to lose hope. Then, something really important happened that would change everything. By 1970, Brian and Mick reconnected with their old producer, Phil Wainman, the one who had helped them earlier. Phil introduced them to 2 young songwriters named Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman. This meeting would prove to be crucial. Nicky and Mike had built up a reputation for writing super catchy pop hit songs that got stuck in people's heads. They were looking for the right group to bring their songs to life and perform them. Brian, Mick, and Steve recorded the vocals for a demo song called Funny Funny. For this demo, session musicians, professional studio musicians, played all the instruments while the Sweet members just sang. When Phil Wainman started offering this song to different record labels, trying to get someone to release it, it caught people's attention immediately. Record companies were interested. This was the break they had been waiting for. Around this same time, the band held auditions to find a new guitarist to replace the one who had left. They found a talented musician from Wales named Andy Scott. Andy had previously worked with Mike McCartney, Paul McCartney's brother, in a group called The Scaffold. He had also played with another band called the Elastic Band. Andy fit in perfectly with Brian, Mick, and Steve. With Andy Scott on guitar, Steve Priest on bass guitar, Mick Tucker on drums, and Brian Connolly as the frontman and lead singer, Sweet finally had what would become their classic, most famous lineup. All 4 members worked together perfectly. They rehearsed for weeks and weeks, practicing their songs and getting tight as a band. Then they made their live debut together on September 26, 1970, at the Windsor Ballroom in Redcar. The chemistry between all 4 of them was absolutely electric. You could feel the energy. Brian's stage presence was unmatched. He knew how to work a crowd. He had natural charm that drew people in, and his voice was simply beautiful. Together, all 4 members had the perfect mix of personality, raw talent, and style. Everything just clicked into place. Soon, the whole world would know their name. Success was right around the corner. Right from the very beginning, Sweet didn't want to sound like every other band out there. They wanted something unique and different. They were inspired by fun, catchy, upbeat groups like the Monkees and the Archies, bands that made you want to sing along and smile. But at the same time, they also really loved the heavier rock sound of powerful bands like The Who played louder and harder. So the members of Sweet made an interesting decision. They decided to mix both of these worlds together. They took the cheerful, happy harmonies of pop music, where voices blend together beautifully, and combined them with distorted, loud guitars and powerful, pounding drumming. This unusual mix of bubblegum, pop music, and hard rock became their trademark. Sound, the thing that made them special and recognizable. It gave them a completely unique style that really stood out from all the other bands playing music during their time. In many ways, Sweet were actually ahead of their time. They were doing something new that nobody else was doing. The sound they created would later go on to inspire glam metal bands many years down the road. Other musicians would copy what Sweet had started. Their journey to fame started pretty modestly and humbly. Their first appearance on an album wasn't even their own record, which was a bit unusual. In December 1970, they appeared on a budget compilation album, a collection of different songs, called Gimme Dat Ding. One side of the record featured a duo called the Pipkins, whose hit song gave the album its funny name. The Sweet filled up the other side of the record with tracks from their 3 Parlophone singles, songs they had already released before. Interestingly, guitarist Andy Scott appeared on the album cover photo, even though he hadn't actually played on any of the songs yet. He was the new member, so he wasn't on those older recordings. Still, even though it was a small thing, it was an important step forward for the band. They were slowly but surely finding their sound and figuring out who they were as a group. It wouldn't take very long before the whole world started to notice them. The real turning point that changed everything came in December 1970. Sweet made their very first television appearance on a popular pop music show called Lift Off. They performed their new song, Funny Funny, on TV where thousands of people could see them. As soon as people heard it, it became very clear that something really special was happening with this band. Around this same time, Sweet signed an important management deal with the successful songwriting team of Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman, the same guys who had written Funny Funny for them. With Phil Wainman back as their executive producer, the person in charge of their recordings, the band also secured a worldwide recording contract with RCA Records. This was huge. It meant their music would be released all around the world. The only place that was different was North America, the United States and Canada. Where a company called Bell Records would handle releasing their music instead. But still, this was a massive deal for the band. In March 1971, RCA Records released Funny Funny, the song written by Chinn and Chapman. Finally, Sweet had their first real success. The song became their first international hit, climbing up into the top 20 on the charts in several different countries. People everywhere were buying the record and requesting it on the radio. The band was thrilled, but not everything they released turned to gold just yet. EMI decided to re-release one of their earlier singles, All You'll Ever Get From Me, in May 1971, hoping it would do better the second time around. But sadly, it still failed to chart. Nobody wanted to buy it. Then came their next single, Coco, released in June 1971. This song was a massive, huge success that really put them on the map. It reached number 2 in the UK charts, which meant almost everyone in Britain was listening to it. The band was becoming genuinely famous now. Their follow-up single after that was called Alexander Graham Bell. This one wasn't quite as big of a hit, reaching number 33 on the charts. It was still respectable, but not as high as they had hoped. Even though these songs were becoming successful and popular, there was something most fans didn't know. Most of the instruments on these recordings were still being played by professional session musicians, not by the actual band members themselves. The members of Sweet mainly provided just the vocals. They sang the songs, but other people played the guitars, bass, and drums on the records. This would change later, but at this stage, they were basically just singers. Later that same year, in November 1971, Sweet released their very first full-length album called Funny How Sweet Coco Can Be. The album included their recent hit singles, plus some brand new songs written by Chinn and Chapman. It also included pop cover songs, new versions of other people's songs, like Daydream by The Lovin', Spoonful and Reflections by The Supremes. The whole album was recorded in London with producer Phil Wainman in charge. The sound engineers were Richard Dodd and Eric Holland, who made sure everything sounded good. Although the album didn't become a major chart success or sell millions of copies, it was still an important milestone and achievement for the band. It showed everyone their potential and what they were capable of. It gave them the push and momentum they needed to aim even higher and dream bigger. By 1972, Sweet were absolutely unstoppable. Nothing could slow them down. In February, they released a song called Papa Joe, which immediately shot to #1 in Sweden and Finland. In the UK, it reached number 11. Fans loved it. Then came two more big hits, Little Willie and Wigwam Bam. Both of these songs climbed all the way to number 4 in the UK charts. Little Willie became their biggest hit in America, reaching number 3 on the US Billboard Hot 100 chart after it was re-released there in 1973. Americans finally discovered Sweet, and they loved what they heard. These songs marked a really big shift and change for the band. Wigwam Bam was actually the first single where the Sweet members played all their own instruments on the recording. No more session musicians. This gave their music a harder edge and more confidence. You could hear the difference. It sounded more real and powerful. In January 1973, they released Blockbuster, and it absolutely exploded. The song hit number 1 in the UK and stayed at the top spot for 5 whole weeks. Everyone in Britain was singing it. You couldn't turn on the radio without hearing it. Their next single, Hellraiser, reached number 2 on the charts. Soon after, their first American album, simply called The Sweet, was released in July 1973. The band was now a household name, which means pretty much everyone in the country knew who they were. To promote their music and get more fans, they appeared on popular TV shows like Top of the Pops and Supersonic, where millions of people watched them perform. One particular performance of Blockbuster on Top of the Pops caused quite a stir and got people talking. Bassist Steve Priest appeared on the show dressed in a German military uniform with a swastika armband, a Nazi symbol. This shocked a lot of people and sparked many complaints from angry viewers who thought it was offensive and inappropriate. But it also showed just how far the band was willing to go to shock audiences and get attention. They wanted people to talk about them, whether the reaction was good or bad. Sweet leaned fully into the glam rock movement that was happening in the early 1970s. They joined other big stars of that era like Gary Glitter, T-Rex, Queen, Slade, and Wizard. All these bands wore wild, colorful costumes that looked almost like they were from outer space. They wore flashy makeup, lipstick, eyeshadow, glitter, and they had huge stage energy that got crowds excited. But behind all the glitter and sparkle, tension was growing inside the band. The members didn't like being seen as just a bubblegum pop act, a band that only made simple, silly songs for kids. They wanted to be taken seriously as real rock musicians who could play their instruments and write meaningful songs. Their management team, Chin and Chapman, kept pushing them to maintain the pop image. They kept writing upbeat, cheerful singles that sold really well and made lots of money. But these songs didn't reflect the band's true sound or what they really wanted to play. The band members felt trapped and frustrated. To balance things out and show their rock side, Sweet started writing their own, heavier, harder songs for the B-sides of their singles. A B-side is the second song on a record that doesn't get played on the radio as much. During live shows and concerts, they began avoiding their early pop hits like Funny Funny and Papa Joe. Instead, they chose to perform their own rock tracks and medleys, combinations, of classic rock songs from other bands. But not everyone in their audiences appreciated this change. Some fans came expecting to hear the happy pop songs they knew from the radio. At one concert in 1973 in Kilmarnock, Scotland, the crowd actually began throwing bottles at the band. It turned into a scary, chaotic situation. Some people blamed the band's glam appearance. The lipstick, eyeshadow, and shiny clothes made them look different from tough rock bands. Other people said the audience just didn't recognize the songs because Sweet was playing deeper album tracks instead of their hits. Either way, it was a rough night, but that chaotic, bottle-throwing night actually inspired one of their biggest hits. The experience led them to write The Ballroom Blitz, which was released later that year and became one of their most famous songs ever. Sometimes bad experiences can lead to great art. Despite all the drama and tension, Sweet's popularity only grew stronger and stronger, especially in the UK, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Australia. In those countries, they were absolutely huge stars. By the end of 1973, the band made a simple but meaningful change. They decided to simplify their name. From that point forward, they would just be called Sweet instead of The Sweet. It was a small change, dropping just one word, but it marked a fresh start and a new chapter. The band members were absolutely determined to take control of their own music and their own image. They had become really frustrated and fed up with Chin and Chapman. Yes, those songwriters' songs had made Sweet famous and successful, but they had also locked them into a pop image that the band felt they had outgrown. They didn't want to be seen as a teen pop band anymore. In fact, the band even rejected and turned down one of Chin and Chapman's songs called Dynamite. They didn't want to record it because it sounded too pop. That song later became a big hit for another group called Mud. But Sweet didn't care. They wanted to move in a different direction. Wanting desperately to prove themselves as real, serious rock musicians, Sweet began working on their own material and writing their own songs. With the help of their producer Phil Wainman and sound engineer Peter Coleman, they recorded an album called Sweet Fanny Adams, which was released in April 1974. The album was absolutely full of self-written hard rock tracks like Sweet F.A. and Set Me Free. These songs were loud, heavy, and aggressive. The album showed a completely new side of the band. They were loud, bold, and finally free from the bubblegum label that had been stuck to them. They were showing the world what they could really do. Their sound was much heavier than before, and their appearance also changed to match. They started looking more like traditional rock musicians, moving away from all the glitter and makeup to a more serious, tough image. They wanted to look like real rockers, not pop stars. The album also featured their signature high-pitched vocal harmonies, where the band members' voices would blend together in a really distinctive way. This became one of the most recognizable parts of their sound. When you heard those harmonies, you knew it was Sweet. But during this time, something terrible happened that would change everything. While the band was working on this album, Brian Connolly was attacked during a fight in Staines, a town in England. He was badly beaten up and injured, suffering serious permanent damage to his throat. This injury affected his vocal cords. After this attack, Brian's singing voice was never, ever the same again. He had lost some of his range and power. His voice, which had once been so strong and beautiful, was damaged forever. Because of this devastating injury, other band members, Steve Priest and Andy Scott, had to step in and sing lead vocals on some of the songs on the album. They sang songs like No You Don't, Into the Night, and Restless, because Brian couldn't do it anymore. Even though Brian was receiving treatment from a throat specialist who was trying to help him recover, he somehow managed to finish working on the album. He was determined not to give up. To the public and the media, the band told everyone that Brian just had a throat infection, a temporary illness. They kept the real story about the attack private and secret because they didn't want people to know the truth. It was embarrassing and scary. The album Sweet Fanny Adams didn't produce any hit singles in the UK, which was disappointing. But in other places around the world like Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, the song Peppermint Twist, our Rebel Rouser, actually reached #1. The record company released it without even telling the band first, which annoyed them. Even though it didn't have hit singles, Sweet Fanny Adams became Sweet's only non-compilation album, an album of new songs, not a collection of old hits, to break into the UK top 40. That was actually a big achievement. Something really special almost happened around this time. The legendary Pete Townshend from The Who invited Sweet to be the opening act for The Who at Charlton Athletics football ground in June 1974. This would have been a dream come true for Sweet, who had always admired The Who and often covered their songs during live shows. Sadly, Brian's throat injury was still too serious, and it forced them to cancel. They had to turn down this amazing opportunity. It was an absolutely heartbreaking moment for a band that had looked up to The Who for so long. Brian must have felt terrible about letting his bandmates down. Still, despite this setback, Sweet were evolving and changing fast. They were successfully stepping away from being pop stars and shaping themselves into true, respected rock icons. Things were looking up, but then everything went horribly wrong. By 1978, Sweet were touring all across the United States, which was a big deal. They were sharing stages with other big-name acts like Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, who were huge stars in America. For Brian Connolly, this should have been another career high point, another moment to celebrate and feel proud of. But behind all the lights, applause, and excitement, things were beginning to fall apart in a terrible way. Between March and May of that year, the band performed all across America in different cities. And then, on May 3rd, in Birmingham, Alabama, everything came crashing down in the worst possible way. Capitol Records executives were sitting in the audience that night, ready to watch Sweet's performance. These were important music industry people who could help the band's career. But instead of seeing a strong professional show, they witnessed a complete disaster that nobody could forget. Brian came out on stage that night visibly drunk. You could tell immediately that something was very wrong. His voice was slurred and hard to understand. His movements were unsteady. He was stumbling around on stage. Then, midway through the performance, the worst thing happened. Brian actually collapsed right there on stage in front of everyone. He fell down and couldn't continue. The rest of the band had no choice but to keep playing and finish the show without their lead singer, which was incredibly awkward and embarrassing. It was a moment that changed absolutely everything for the band. The show ended early, and the terrible incident deeply embarrassed both Brian and the rest of the group. The Capitol Records executives had seen the whole thing. It looked completely unprofessional. This could ruin their chances in America. When the band returned briefly to Britain after that disastrous show, things didn't get any better for Brian. In fact, his drinking problem was getting worse and worse. He was drinking more heavily than ever before. His connection with the rest of the band was breaking apart. They barely talked to each other anymore. The friendship and brotherhood they once had was disappearing. By 1923, the time they resumed their second leg of the U.S. tour, later that same month, performing with other rock bands Foghat and Alice Cooper. The tension within the group had become completely unbearable. Nobody wanted to be around each other. Everyone was angry and frustrated. Brian's health was becoming a serious question mark, and nobody could rely on him anymore to show up and perform. His bond with his bandmates, especially with Mick Tucker and Steve Priest, who he had once been so close to, had started to fade away and disappear. By early July 1978, as the tour finally ended, the cracks in the band were absolutely impossible to ignore anymore. Everything was broken, and everyone knew it couldn't continue like this. Later that same year, in October 1978, all the members of Sweet gathered at a place called Clearwell Castle. They were there to work on writing new material for their next album. They spent days working on new songs together. After the writing sessions were done, they moved to a recording studio called Townhouse Studios in Shepherd's Bush, London, to begin actually recording an album called Cut Above the Rest. But all the tension and bad feelings inside the band followed them right into that studio. The problems didn't go away just because they were making music. Brian's health and his completely unpredictable behavior had become a major concern for everyone. His condition made the recording sessions really difficult and stressful. The atmosphere in the studio was strained and uncomfortable. Nobody was having fun anymore. Making music felt like work, not joy. Mick Tucker, who had been Brian's old friend and fellow founding member since the very beginning, was asked to help produce Brian's vocal parts on the album. The rest of the band believed that Mick could bring out the best in Brian. After all, they had known each other for so many years and had been through so much together. If anyone could help Brian, it would be Mick. They recorded several tracks that featured Brian's vocals, hoping and praying they could somehow capture the old magic that had once defined Sweet. They wanted to hear the Brian they remembered, the golden voice that had made them famous. But when all the recording sessions were finally done and they listened back to what they had recorded, the results disappointed and saddened everyone. Brian's voice, which had once been so powerful and commanding and beautiful, had lost its strength. It didn't sound like the old Brian anymore. You could hear the damage, the years of struggle, the pain. The band members looked at each other and knew the truth. They couldn't move forward like this. Something had to change. As painful as it was to admit, Brian couldn't be in the band anymore. He was holding them back, and his health was too unreliable. On November 2nd, 1978, Brian Connolly quietly left Sweet. There was no big announcement, no press conference, no farewell show. He just left. A few months later, on February 23, 1979, the band's manager, David Walker, made the announcement. Public so everyone would know. The official statement that was released to the media said that Brian was leaving to start a solo career and explore country, rock music, a different style of music that was more mellow and American-sounding. But in truth, everyone close to the situation knew the real reasons. His health problems, his drinking, and the growing distance between him and the other band members had made it completely impossible to continue working together. Brian's departure marked the end of an era for Sweet. The classic lineup was broken forever. The golden voice was gone. After leaving Sweet, Brian hoped and dreamed of rebuilding his career and finding success on his own. He wanted to prove that he could still make it as a musician. But sadly, things didn't go the way he had planned at all. His first release as a solo artist was a single titled "Don't You Know a Lady," which was written by a songwriter named Roger Greenaway. Brian put all his hopes into this song. Sadly, it completely failed to make any impact at all. Nobody bought it, radio stations didn't play it, and it disappeared without a trace. By 1982, Brian's contract with Polydor Records had ended. The label didn't want to work with him anymore. But Brian didn't give up. He signed with a French record label called Carrere Records, hoping for a fresh start in Europe. A UK music magazine called Record Business announced that Brian's new single, called Hypnotized, would be released in March 1982. It was his first solo single in 3 whole years since leaving Sweet. That's a long time to be away from the music scene. The song Hypnotized was a hard rock track written by Joe Lynn Turner. It had originally been performed by a band called Fandango. Brian's version was released across Europe through RCA Records, giving it wide distribution. But once again, it didn't chart anywhere. Nobody was buying his music. Even though he was struggling, Brian didn't stop working. He recorded several brand new songs for an upcoming album that was planned to be released in August 1983. He probably spent months working on these songs. But tragically, that album was never actually released. The record company must have canceled it because Brian's music wasn't selling. All that work was for nothing. Still, Brian refused to give up on his dream. He kept trying. In January 1983, he performed as a supporting act, the opening band for Pat Benatar, who was a huge rock star at the time. He did 3 shows, in Birmingham, Newcastle, and at London's famous Hammersmith Odeon venue. This was a big opportunity to perform in front of large crowds. Brian's band for these shows was called Encore. It featured some really talented musicians, including John Verity from a band called Argent and Terry Utley from Smokey. Together, they performed a mix of old sweet hits and new solo songs. They played songs including Windy City, Fox on the Run, Hypnotized, and original tracks like Sick and Tired, Red Hot and Rage, and Burning the Candle at Both Ends. Some of these performances were later recorded by fans and shared on bootleg recordings, unofficial recordings that people traded with each other. But these weren't official releases, so Brian didn't make any money from them. But while Brian was fighting so hard to rebuild his musical career and stay relevant, another huge blow struck him that he wasn't expecting. The British tax office, known as the Inland Revenue, hit him and all the other members of Sweet with a massive, enormous tax bill for money they had earned during their successful years.